As much as I wanted to enjoy the French Grand Prix, I just couldn't. Most of the excitement during the race unfortunately came from the Ferrari imploding yet again. Sure, there was some questionable Russell on Perez action and some interesting parking lessons from Stroll to Vettel, but basically this was just another Leclerc pole converted to an easy Verstappen race win. Now, I'm sure if you saw the thumbnail and the title of this video, we've got one big question in mind, and don't worry, we've got all the data. My name is Blake, and welcome to Break F1. After spending 10 years as a trackside and simulator performance engineer at both Force India and Red Bull Racing, I decided it was time to give YouTube what I think it needed, some data-driven Formula 1 content. On this channel, I do my best to help make data a little bit less intimidating and hopefully easier to understand. So, in this video focusing on the French Grand Prix, we're definitely going to talk about Ferrari. This weekend, they went from hero to zero pretty quickly. Their hero moment was out-qualifying Red Bull by one of the largest margins we've seen since Monaco. And, well, there were a few zero moments. Now, let's be honest. Leclerc has been pretty much flawless this season, with the exception of his spin during the Imola race when he was chasing down Perez, and now this weekend when he sent it just a bit too deep and too fast into Le Bousset. But realistically, he's been very consistent at delivering flawless qualifying performances. You've got a feel for him right now. During the race, Sainz also had a botched pit stop and unsafe release, which cost him a 5-second penalty. After the race, a lot of people asked me, did Ferrari screw up Sainz's strategy? Could he have stayed out and finished closer to the front? We'll see what the numbers have to say about that in just a second. While we're being honest, the red car is the fastest car, but there's some very interesting differences between the Ferrari and the Red Bull, and you can bet we're going to have a look at the lap telemetry and try to understand the strengths and weaknesses of both of these cars. Now, speaking of the Red Bull, after the tire management disaster that they had in Austria, they seemed in a much better place in France. Max didn't have an answer for Leclerc in qualifying, but he had plenty of pace to keep up with him during the race. Now, on the other hand, Perez seemed to have another one of those off weekends. Where is Max finding so much time over Perez in qualifying and the race? We'll dig into that soon. Finally, the question that everybody's been asking me, is Mercedes back? They seem to qualify well and race even better than that. I mean, Lewis has been on the podium in the last 4 races, and Mercedes scored their first double podium of the season. Surely this is good news, right? In case you want the short version, no, they're not going to win the championship this year, but it's not all bad. I'll dig into it and give you my no BS answer on that in just a minute. So let's get into the video. Now, there is honestly zero debate for me. The Ferrari is outright the fastest car this season. This is what all the qualifying performance gaps look like for all of the dry qualifying sessions that we've seen this season. Over a single lap, Ferrari is faster than Red Bull in every single qualifying, or at least just about the same pace. And also during the race, they're equal pace or faster as well. That being said, I think in Austria and even France, the Ferrari was clearly the fastest car on race day. But let's quickly look at the single lap pace and try to understand from the fundamental point of view what the differences are between the Red Bull and the Ferrari. Now, this is a basic telemetry compare for Verstappen in blue and Leclerc in red. This is their fastest qualifying 3 laps. If you're new to this kind of plot, on the top is our car speed. Here is our throttle trace. Here's DRS on or off. So that's DRS on, that's DRS off. And here's the lap time delta. In this instance, when the line goes above 0, Verstappen's ahead. And when it goes below 0, Leclerc is ahead. Now, if you're wondering where this is on the track, this is the start of the lap and this is the end of the lap. Here you can see turn 1, 2. Here's the chicane, turn 8, 9. Here's the long sweeping left-hander of turn 11. And then here's the final corner of 14 and 15. So what I can tell from this plot is that Red Bull is clearly running lower downforce. You can see their straight line speed at the end of every straight is quite a bit higher. Now, on this instance, the reason Leclerc is closer than here is because Leclerc had a tow from Sainz on his fastest lap. That means Sainz went out ahead of Leclerc deliberately so that he could reduce the amount of drag that Leclerc experienced and increase his top speed. Now, as expected, due to the Red Bull running lower downforce, their high-speed cornering performance is not as good as the Ferraris. You can see that here in turn 1, 2, and in turn 11, and also in the entry to some of the higher speed corners, clearly demonstrating that the Red Bull is running a bit less downforce. Now, in general, I think turn 11 is a very interesting one because we saw in Austria in turn 6, 7, the 2 sweeping long, fast left-hand corners on the circuit. Red Bull were also very weak there relative to Ferrari, despite what I thought looked like they were running very similar downforce levels. So Ferrari, pretty impressive in qualifying pace here. Now, this is lap 12 during the race for Verstappen and Leclerc. Again, we've got Verstappen in blue and Leclerc in red. In terms of the time gained and lost, this is very similar to what we saw in qualifying, with the exception of Red Bull gaining a substantial amount of time back when the DRS is activated here, here, and here. So again, Red Bull losing out here in turns 1, 2, 11, 12, and 14, 15, just a little bit. So realistically, there's nothing stand out in the performance differences between Red Bull in qualifying and Red Bull in the race. Pretty much in summary, the Red Bull has reasonable low speed performance and good straight line speed. Ferrari with strong braking, excellent high speed and medium speed performance, and great traction. The Ferrari is the outright fastest car, but the performance deltas mean that the Red Bull should be able to stay in striking distance during the race and maintain pressure on the Ferrari until they crack, which we see them doing quite frequently. Now, let's have a quick look at the race pace difference between Leclerc and Verstappen and try to understand what's going on. Let me first start by saying that I think the 2022 tires and air regulations are still doing a great job. Drivers can push up behind another car for an extended period of time, which has made some very close racing, giving drivers a lot of opportunities to attack and defend without burning up their tires immediately, and they can still follow closely without the penalties of so much dirty air like we saw in the previous regulations. Now, here are the fuel-corrected lap times for the first stint between Leclerc and Verstappen. In short, here's how fuel-corrected lap times work. I can guess how much fuel the teams are putting in the cars. It's probably somewhere between 105 and 110 kilos. I also know the number of laps in the race, so I can guess how much fuel they're using per lap. I also know that 1 kilo of fuel is worth about 2 to 3 hundredths of a second in terms of lap time. So for every lap of the race, I can estimate how much fuel mass is hurting the lap time or pace and remove that from the lap time. That gives us a great way to compare across stints and compounds throughout the race at differing fuel loads. Now we can tell from this that Verstappen is able to match Leclerc's lap times until around lap 10. Now this is where Verstappen stops a little bit early and tries for the undercut. But you can see as soon as Max falls away from Leclerc, Charles is no longer driving defensively and he's able to improve his lap times quite a bit compared to here. Now, this just goes to show you how much lap time the drivers actually lose from defending. Max also loses the DRS on lap 13 here, allowing Leclerc to pull away even further. Unfortunately, that is the only data we have from Leclerc. After this lap, he ends up in the wall on the exit of turn 11, but realistically, I think the Ferrari had the upper hand in terms of pace, and my gut feeling is that they would have had a reasonable performance on the hard tire as well. Now, considering Leclerc's lap time, I don't see Max getting the undercut done, as it looks like Leclerc would have just been able to extend his gap for at least a few more laps. As far as what happened to Leclerc, I think it was honestly just a mistake. I don't have the telemetry from after the session, but my buddy F1 Techie from Twitter was wise enough to record the live telemetry, so here's what that looks like. Now, without going into too much detail, it simply looks like a mistake. Leclerc just carries in so much more speed into turn 11 than his previous fast lap of the race and loses the rear end and slides into the barriers. Now, Ferrari's strength in turn 11 and the ability to carry a lot of speed probably meant that they were just on the edge in terms of balance for the race, and Leclerc just made a mistake. Now let's introduce another presentation of the data quickly as we wrap up Verstappen's race. This is what I like to call the race trace, and this chart simply demonstrates the gaps between all of the drivers throughout the race. Here on the left is the start of the race, and here on the right is the end of the race. I've even marked out the safety car and virtual safety car periods. The way to interpret this graph is just to look at the gap between one driver and another. You can see here that Max is about 10 seconds ahead of Lewis at the end of the race. Now you can also see when a driver pits and loses a lot of lap time. We refer to this as the pit lane time loss. Now, Max really didn't have much going on in his race after Leclerc retired. You can see he's out here on the medium tire. He stops just before the safety car period and then cruises to the end of the race on a hard tire to finish 10 seconds ahead of Lewis. Considering the pace gap to the Mercedes in the race, I don't think Max had much to worry about. He could kind of manage and slowly build up a gap to Lewis and secure the win pretty easily. Realistically, I think Leclerc should be at least tied in the Drivers' Championship with Max, but he has been a little bit unlucky with strategy in a few places, but let's be honest. The DNFs due to reliability and his mistake here are actually the killer in terms of Leclerc's points. Max with a very healthy lead on the Drivers' Championship standings. Speaking of Ferrari reliability, Sainz started from the back due to taking new PU components this weekend. Now, like most of you, I've got a few questions over Sainz's race. Was the hard, medium, one-stop strategy the right strategy? Where would he have finished without the 5-second penalty from his unsafe release? And finally, should he have stopped for new mediums at the end of the race or stayed out? Let's talk about his race and strategy and see what we can make out of this whole thing. Now, regarding Sainz's outright pace, he was pretty much flying this weekend. He didn't set a Q3 lap, but his Q2 lap was good enough for P2 ahead of Verstappen. As for the race, Sainz spent most of his time in traffic, so there's not really a whole lot to look at here. But as far as Sainz's strategy, he was one of the 3 drivers to start on a hard tire. The race in the end looks like an easy one-stop for most, and I think the hard-medium strategy for Sainz actually makes sense. Sainz has a substantial pace advantage over all the back markers and midfield teams, so he should have enough pace in hand on the hard tire to come through the field, and put on a medium tire for a shorter, fast stint to the end of the race. So let's have a look at Sainz's race trace and discuss. I've also highlighted Perez here for a little bit of discussion later. So I think the hard medium one stop sounds sensible, but unfortunately Ferrari had themselves over again. Leclerc's crash caused an early safety car, which forces Sainz early onto the medium. Now the pit lane time loss at Paul Ricard is pretty big, and stopping under the safety car just makes time loss so much smaller. So it's a no-brainer to stop Sainz here. But that means they have to do 35 laps on a medium at this point, and no one has done more than 18 laps on that tire in the race so far. To make things even more painful, Ferrari had an issue at the pit stop, and in the confusion had an unsafe release into the Williams, which landed them a 5-second penalty. Now, they've got two options to serve this penalty. They can stay out on the same set of medium tires and take the time penalty on their race time, but if they stop again, they must hold the car for 5 seconds until they perform the pit stop. Now, we can see Sainz come through Russell here quite easily, and then he approaches Perez. Now, I'm sure the TV feed was delayed a little bit, but it seems like the Ferrari pit will have absolutely no idea what's going on as they ask Carlos to box just as he's finally getting the overtake done on Perez. So let's discuss the final 2 points. Without the 5-second time penalty, where would Sainz have finished? Honestly, I think it makes no difference to this race if he had the 5-second time penalty or not. Let me explain. Here's what that race trace looks like correcting and removing that 5-second penalty at the stop. And he still does not close the gap to Perez and Russell ahead. You can see I've just moved him from here to here and extrapolated so he finishes in about the right spot, removing the 5-second loss right here. Now, as far as the final question, should Sainz have held track position on the medium and stayed out? Honestly, no. I don't think so. No one had done more than 18 or 20 laps on a medium tire, and Sainz's front right tire had some substantial blisters. Now, I doubt he had much more pace in hand after pushing up and fighting with Perez for so many laps. Realistically, with the 5-second time penalty, Sainz would have ended up roughly in the same spot. He would have gone out here, taken a 5-second penalty, and ended up somewhere around here. Honestly, I think pitting for new mediums was the right call, and Ferrari's main loss of points this weekend wasn't down to their pit crew or strategy. Their biggest loss of points was unfortunately Leclerc's mistake, but that's racing. Now, at the beginning of the race, he's got 5 or 6 laps attacking Hamilton and then just kind of runs out of steam. During the second stint, he's able to attack Hamilton a little bit longer, but again runs out of steam and falls back into Sainz. Now, later in the race, Perez gets eaten alive on the VSC restart by Russell. Now, to be fair, there was some issue with the marshalling system, which means the drivers got one VSC ending message, a very long pause, and then a further VSC ending message, which caught Checo out, and Russell got him easily to secure the final podium spot. I've also heard a lot of very interesting speculations that Checo was probably running a different spec car during the race, and maybe a new floor to deal with the upcoming flexi floor regulation changes in Spa, but honestly, I think that's absolute nonsense. Now, I don't know for sure, but honestly, it makes no sense for a team at all to run a test specification part during a race, especially if that part is slower. If anything, they would have tested this component in free practice 1, gathered the necessary data, and then moved on to ensure the drivers had the best hardware for qualifying and the race. From what I can tell, Checo just didn't have the pace on Sunday. He was a little bit off in practice all weekend, got a decent qualifying on Saturday, but it just means that Mercedes did in fact beat one of the Red Bulls on pace. Now, speaking of Mercedes, I think this is the point that we've all been waiting for. Mercedes scored their first double podium of the year, and Lewis has finished on the podium in every race since Canada. Does this mean they've solved their issues and are back? Well, let's talk about it. They are currently third in the Constructors' Championship, only 44 points behind Ferrari. Now, at this point, I would not be that surprised to see Ferrari struggling even more with engine penalties and issues. Imagine Mercedes finishing P2 in the Constructors' Championship when it's clear that Ferrari is legitimately the fastest car. Now, in terms of Mercedes' path back to their winning ways, I think they've got a long road ahead of them, and I'll explain that. Mercedes have been arguably one of the most reliable teams and consistent enough to pick up the pieces when either Red Bull or Ferrari have issues. But in terms of outright pace, they are still clearly third best in terms of pace in both qualifying and the race. After qualifying 4th and 6th in France, Lewis finished just 10 seconds off the race winner Verstappen, with Russell 5 seconds or so behind him. Now, this chart shows the gap to pole position in terms of percent lap time for all of the dry qualifying sessions this year. In terms of qualifying pace, Mercedes have been pretty much the same gap they've had to Ferrari all season, between 0.75 and 1.25%. Yes, all the teams are probably developing their car, but Mercedes have not been able to outdevelop Red Bull or the Ferrari enough to close the gap. Now, let's see what this kind of performance gap looks like from the telemetry data. Now, here's a comparison of Hamilton and Leclerc's Q3 laps. Realistically, the Mercedes is not faster than the Ferrari, anywhere on the lap. Now, the Mercedes engine still appears to be down a little bit on grunt, or they're just running a little bit more downforce than the Ferrari. You can see this as the Ferrari gains pretty much just gradually on all the straights, but I don't think that is the biggest limitation for me. Now, obviously down to turn 10, Leclerc's quite a bit faster as he had a tow from Sainz, but in terms of high-speed performance, the Ferrari, especially in turn 11, very strong. Another thing I will say, on a single lap, the Mercedes seems to struggle a little bit at the end of the lap. So maybe their tire management on the softer compounds in this event is not as good. You can see for a similar speed range corner at the beginning of the lap where Mercedes is actually close, the Ferrari are just so much faster at the end of the lap compared to the Mercedes. Now, you say that Mercedes' race pace is quite strong, and I agree with you completely. They seem to be making some improvements, but they're still quite a way off. In terms of outright pace, in Silverstone and France, they were in the mix, and at the other races, they've kind of been in that no man's land between the front runners and the midfield. But let's look at their pace from Paul Ricard and see what we can understand. Now, here's our race trace highlighting the Red Bull and the Mercedes cars. For the most part, we've kind of covered all this already, but we'll discuss it a little bit more. My overall summary is that Verstappen is just getting the most out of the Red Bull, and he's out of reach for the Mercedes. On pure pace, the Ferraris were as fast or faster than Verstappen. Without any fighting Leclerc in the second stint, Verstappen could easily pull away and look after his tires at the same time. Lewis didn't really stand a chance of closing that gap. At this event, arguably, Russell has not been as comfortable as Lewis in qualifying or the race, but in terms of outright pace, I think Russell was slightly faster than Perez. Clearly, he had quite a few goes at him here, and the VSC issue here meant he easily got the overtake on Perez. And judging from their clear air stints, I think Hamilton was just a little bit faster than Russell this weekend. But to be fair, Perez had absolutely no chance on either stint of overtaking Hamilton. And Russell was able to fully put Perez under pressure, especially here at the end of the race. So, another weekend of Ferrari misery, which is letting Verstappen and the Red Bulls run away with both of the championships. Due to their consistency and reliability, Mercedes are hoovering up all the spare points left available. But to their credit, their race pace is becoming very reasonable, but their single lap pace leaves a lot to be desired. Either way, we're just halfway through the season and a lot can change in a very short period of time. I even alluded to it before in the championship standings. Mercedes very well could take Ferrari for P2 in the constructors. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I hope the data was not too intimidating. I'll see you guys next weekend for our Hungary race analysis.